This is the second part of 2 or 3 videos for Chapter 7. And I'm continuing with Alexander Hamilton. I don't know why the first one was cut off, but anyway, he becomes George Washington's basically chief of staff, right-hand man in the Revolution, becomes his proofreader, actually, because he was well-educated and Washington wasn't. But this is a guy, you can see from the slide, who very attractive. I want you to get a handle on his personality because he's really a mixed bag. Clearly a genius intellect. Quickly saw solutions, jumped into what people should do, sometimes too fast, but a perfect foil to George Washington, who is very deliberate, very slow, very cautious in his decisions. Examples of Hamilton's genius: he completed a 3-year law degree in 9 months while he's serving as George Washington's aide in the middle of the Revolution. So he's studying at night to get his law degree. He's a model for college students everywhere. Federalist leader in New York, while he is the most popular and well-known lawyer in the city, a lot of lawyers in New York City then and now. Key figure at the Constitutional Convention. He had the brilliant talent, along with John Adams, of being able to speak off the cuff and organize thoughts in his head and talk without notes, and convinced many in the Constitutional Convention that the Constitution was worth adopting. At one point, he gave a 6-hour speech arguing to adopt the Constitution with no break for 6 hours and no notes. So he could compose political arguments in his head. I give half-hour videos and I have to have my notes in front of me. It's a very admirable trait. John Adams was so suspicious of Hamilton and his genius, he said the guy's got to be using drugs. Hamilton must be on opium. There's no way he could do that without being on drugs. As far as we know, there were no drugs involved. Otherwise, it would have shown up in the musical Hamilton. So who is this character? His personality in the musical is pretty authentic. It's taken from a 900-page biography written about Hamilton about 15 years ago. He wrote most of the Federalist Papers while he is working full-time. Example, again, it was very common to pass Hamilton's house in the middle of the night and his lamp would be burning in the study. So he is clearly hyperactive, incredibly productive. He is also totally honest. When he was Secretary of the Treasury under Washington, he stopped any other income. He stopped doing any of his lawyer business because he was worried about conflicts of interest. Does any of this sound familiar in recent American history? He left government service poorer than when he went in, which again is a pretty rare thing in government service today. So he worked totally for the American government and not for himself. He repeatedly turned down real estate deals in New York City while this was going on and took charity legal cases, people who could not afford pro bono cases. Even Jefferson said when he became president after John Adams and looked over the financial records, and I'm quoting Jefferson, his sworn enemy, Hamilton made no blunders and wisely and skillfully managed the bank and the finances, which he did. Hamilton said, I would risk my life, but not my character, not my reputation, to rise in the world, to exalt my station. And he actually did this. There are times when he had incredibly bad judgment, and this is one of them. He publicly admitted adultery. It's always sex. He is the first sex scandal in American history, and this is an indication of his really bad judgment, although there's some background to it that he may have been trapped into this. The woman was a woman named Maria Reynolds. This is in 1790. Hamilton has a pregnant wife at home and 6 other children of different ages. And at the peak of his power, middle of the warfare with Thomas Jefferson and who's going to have power in the country, he has an affair. He was 36 years old, 6 kids, and a pregnant wife at home. And you think, what are you thinking, Alexander Hamilton? He always charmed women. His sister-in-law adored him. His wife adored him. There's some evidence that Reynolds' husband was setting her up for blackmailing Hamilton. He has a couple of meetings with her. They do have sex. And he begins to get letters about payments. Actually, what Reynolds wanted from him was a federal job as well as some money. Friends urged him, hide the affair, pay the guy off, and he actually did send some payments to the Reynolds couple. But after a while, he says, no, this is going to be trouble. It's going to ruin my reputation as an honest man. So as an honest man, he publishes the affair in the New York newspapers. He says, I am an adulterer, but I am not dishonest financially. Most people today would do the opposite and have done the opposite. This is a case of his public honor. The whole world knows, including his wife, that he's an adulterer, and she still continued to adore him. He said, I have been grossly charged with being a speculator, basically ripping off the US government, but I am only an adulterer. Very famous line. Maria Reynolds shortly divorced her husband, did not continue the affair with Hamilton. The lawyer in the divorce case was Aaron Burr. He's going to come back again. So here is a guy who is absolutely a genius, but with some real flaws in his character. His great historical hero was Julius Caesar. If you remember any Roman history, Julius Caesar is the guy who turned Rome from a democratic republic into a dictatorship, into an imperial power. So this is not what you announced publicly in early American history after a revolt against England. Hamilton is not the easiest person to get along with. He is aggressive. He's touchy about his background because he is a bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. He is hypersensitive. He's arrogant. He's pushy. He's brash. He's high-strung, very quick to anger, and never, ever back down in an argument or a personal discussion. Very witty, very sharp tongue, very outspoken guy, but clearly did not know when to shut up and just leave things alone. Not the easiest guy to get along with. If you disagreed with him, and this is a friend talking of him, it's a great line because we all know people like this. He is the kind of man who not only needs to win every argument, but also needs to demonstrate that you had lost the argument. But being a genius, he usually won them. Well-versed in a number of different fields, well-informed, he cannot compromise. He would carry on arguments in print and in person for months. So a touchy personality, but clearly a political genius. It is a good thing that we had him there for setting up a financial plan. Hang on, let me get my notes here. Second set of notes. Sorry, mildly disorganized. I broke my wrist the other day, so I'm sitting here holding this up. Hamilton is asked by George Washington, put together an economic plan for the country. Washington knows how to run a farm, but he knows nothing else about finances. The guy in his cabinet who did know, who actually ran the business in the Caribbean and who knew a lot about it, was Hamilton. So he comes to Hamilton and says, you're Secretary of the Treasury at 34 years old, and put together an economic plan for the country. As Secretary of the Treasury, he had 39 clerks and 1,000 custom officials. He is the largest department in the federal government. He had previously also been the state treasurer of New York, so he has some background in this. He locks himself in his study for about 4 or 5 months, borrows every book on economics he could from all of his friends, and single-handedly, off the top of his head, puts together an economic plan for America in under 4 months, doing all the math and the calculations himself. People have looked at it, 100% accurate. The U.S. economy was in serious trouble. We had debts all over the place to European countries, to individuals. We had stopped paying interest on the debts. We had not enough money coming in. Our word in England and in Europe, our financial backing was nothing because nobody trusted us. And he comes up off the top of his head with a plan that solves everything within a very few years. So clearly a genius. First part of his plan is funding and assumption, which sounds complicated, but is not terribly complicated at all. Funding and assumption meant to fund the national debt and assume the debts of the states. How do we deal with all of these debts from the American Revolution? Individual states had debts. The nation as a whole had debts. They totaled about $77 million at the time, which was big bucks. We have money we owe to France and other countries. We have debts all over the place. Half of the American economy was being spent to just pay down the debts, not to build up the country. Speculators had bought and sold this paper money that was issued during the war to pay our soldiers at 10 cents on the dollar. The complication was that some of the states, most of the states in the South, had already paid off their debts. They had cash crops like tobacco and rice. The northern states had not paid off their debts. Hamilton's plan was to consolidate all of the war debts, give them all to the federal government, and pay every single debt at face value. What this means is that all that paper money that was floating around that had been bought up by wealthy people, because they're the ones who had extra money, was no longer owned by the soldiers who had been fought and earned it. Hamilton says, pay it all off. Buy up all that paper money at whatever it says. So instead of the 10 cents on the dollar that the banker had paid for it, you pay him $1 because the bill says $1. This was hugely controversial. There are 6 months of debates between the states and between the federal government. Who is going to get the money? In the end, Hamilton won out, and the national government assumed all the debts from the war, including the state debts. How did he do this? This was the big bargain, and Thomas Jefferson brokered a compromise. He called Madison into dinner and Hamilton into dinner. He had his French chef cook up a lovely meal. They had 4 or 5 bottles of wine, and they came up with a compromise. The southern states that already had paid their debts had to be given something. So what do you give them? You give them the new national capital because we hadn't decided where to build Washington, D.C. The northern states would have their state debts paid off, and everybody would get something out of it. For 10 years, Philadelphia would stay the national capital, and we would begin to build a new capital between the states of Maryland and Virginia. If you look where Washington, D.C. is, that's exactly where it is. Who are you going to get to pick the exact spot? The man who has been trained as a surveyor, whom everybody trusts, George Washington. So George Washington is the guy you can blame for picking a place that was basically a swamp for Washington, D.C., with terrible summer weather. Why did he pick this particular place? If you find out where Mount Vernon is, it's 10 miles down the river from Washington, D.C. So what happens to Washington's real estate? It becomes much more valuable once Washington, D.C. is built. And I have a city map plan, aerial view of Washington, D.C. The plan was laid out and built according to a French architect that had worked as a member of George Washington's staff, not according to Jefferson's grid plan. So you have these little star-shaped things. If you ever drive around Washington, D.C., it's almost impossible to drive around town because there's no really through streets. Everything stops at plazas, which is very lovely to walk in, but not terrible to drive in. Okay, so the goal here, solve the problem. Coincidentally, who gets power out of this? The federal government becomes more powerful because, number one, it has credibility, it is paying off its debts, and because the rich, the wealthy, will support the federal government if the government owes them money and is going to pay them off. Nobody cares about you and me supporting the federal government. We're poor people. But you want the wealthy to support the federal government. If the wealthy support it, it is much more likely to succeed, and they will invest their money in it. So that is the first of Hamilton's plans. The second is the bank bill. That also passed after furious debate in Congress. This is a constitutional issue. Where in the Constitution does it say the federal government can set up a bank or any banks? It doesn't. So these are the implied powers of the Constitution that the Federalists are using, not exactly what it says, but that the federal government has the implied power or the suggested power to do anything it needs to. This is central economic power, not listed in the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton argues the Constitution gives the federal government broad powers to control the currency, to control finances. Everything was a mess. Up until the Constitution, up until Hamilton's plan, every state was printing its own money. Towns were printing their own money. Sometimes stores were printing their own money. Certainly different small banks were printing their own money. There were not enough coins. A lot of this is paper money. You all know if you've traveled from one country to another, before the EU, you had to exchange your money. Every time you exchange your money, you lose some to the exchange. This happened if you traveled from Maryland to Virginia, because everybody had different money. So total chaos. What the bank bill does, first of all, is create a national mint and create coins. So there is a standard currency. And again, Thomas Jefferson stepped in and said, let's use a decimal system rather than the British pounds and shillings, which is not on a system of tens. So thank goodness he did that. They also created a national bank, a central bank, basically to control other banks. Since the federal government did not have much money, 20% would be funded by the federal government, 80% would be funded by wealthy investors. And this is where the problem is with many members of Congress. Who's going to benefit from this? If the wealthy invest their money, of course, they're going to earn interest on it, and the wealthy are going to end up wealthier. You and me, the common man, are not going to benefit from a national bank. And there's huge opposition to the bank bill. But the government is pretty broke. And again, Hamilton sees, which most others didn't, that you have to get the wealthy to invest in the federal government, and this is one way to do it. So after furious debate, the bank bill is finally passed, and the wealthy support the success of the federal government. Unlike most European countries today, the United States, we do have a federal bank, but we don't have one on every corner. We have private banking that is controlled by a federal agency. If you go to European countries, you have Santander in Spain, you have Bank of England, you have Bank of Scotland, you have a national bank in France, and they have ATMs on the corner. Our national bank does not do that. It is basically a central controlling agency. It does not do the actual banking. Hamilton does this himself and draws up the papers to charter the national bank. The third part of his plan is the report on manufactures. This did not pass. It is so ahead of its time, people didn't understand what he was talking about. The first two were passed, the third did not. Again, the goal, Hamilton says, we have to promote industry, we have to promote manufacturing, we have to promote American businesses, not to replace agriculture, but basically to buy American. We have to create things here, because if we don't, we are going to have to import it, and our money and our profits are going to go to some other country. A good example of this is if you go to Walmart, turn over any product in Walmart, what does it say on the bottom? Made in China. Our money goes to China, our jobs go to China. Hamilton saw, well before China, we need to keep manufacturing here. We need to make things in America so Americans can buy them, otherwise the money's going elsewhere. How do you do this? He suggested in his bill what we use today, incentives and rebates, to help individuals build factories in America. He wanted bounties by the federal government. You build a shoe factory, the federal government would help you if the business was necessary for America. He wanted the federal government also to build roads and canals to tie the country together because our transportation system really didn't exist at the time. Part of this bill was the whiskey tax, to raise the federal money so that the federal government could invest in businesses. And the Whiskey Rebellion was the direct result of that. Hamilton himself invested money in a factory in New Jersey. So he actually put his money where his mouth was. The weaknesses of this, which we have seen in contemporary history, even in Austin, is you give people rebates, you give them incentives, let's say tax cuts to build in Austin, they don't always carry through. So you have to have penalties with it. The Domain is a good example. They were given all kinds of utility and tax rebates on the promise that they would create X amount of jobs at such and such salaries, quote unquote, good jobs. Didn't happen that way. Hamilton assumes that the wealthy are going to put the country's interest above their own self-interest. Doesn't always happen. This is Hamilton. Men will pursue their interest. It is as easy to change human nature as to oppose the strong current of the selfish passions. A wise legislature will gently divert the channel and direct it to the public good. He is trying to get the federal government to direct investment for the good of the country. It doesn't always turn out like that. And that bill, which was way ahead of its time, did not pass. People did not understand Buy American at the time. Too complicated. Okay, so dueling, slide 20 in there. You have an image of a duel. Hamilton serves under George Washington. He and John Adams are bitter enemies, although they're both Federalists. The two of them could not get along personally, clash of personalities. So he's pretty much out of office when John Adams becomes president in 96. He goes back to his private practice. He's a leading figure in New York City. He has this affair. He publishes it. And there is a long-running feud between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. It goes back decades. They are both New Yorkers. They are both politically ambitious. Both of them at one point ran for governor of New York. Aaron Burr is Jefferson's vice president. Why was he put on as vice president? He claims he is a Republican. Basically, he's out for himself, but he claims he's a Republican. They had to have somebody from New York to get the swing votes so Jefferson could be elected. I'll talk about that in Jefferson's election. Burr proves himself to be a man of no principles whatsoever. Hamilton knew this. Hamilton saw Aaron Burr as a distinct danger to the country, and in several other cases, published in New York papers. Aaron Burr is a man of no morals, public or private. The man has no principles. Those were fighting words at the time. Aaron Burr immediately challenges Hamilton to a duel. Now, a duel is not a shootout in the Old West. It is not a quick draw event. It is strictly an affair of honor. So you are challenged to a duel. You have to accept either that or leave the country, because if you don't, your reputation is ruined and you have proved yourself to be a yellow-livered coward. And I wish we had a live class, because I usually enact a duel without weapons. We have no concealed carry in my classroom. So you line up, you have your assistant with you. Both guys bring an assistant. There's usually a doctor there. There's usually a neutral party that calls the command, and you line up back to back. You have a single shot pistol in your hand, and you walk anything from 10 to 20 paces. It was determined ahead of time. And then you turn and you shoot. It is not a quick draw, because you have a single shot. So you shoot. If you get the guy, you won the duel. If you miss the guy, then what? Then you have to stand there and let him take his best shot. So many times people hesitate to shoot because if the other guy misses, you have a pretty clear shot at a standing figure. You will notice in that slide that they are standing sideways to each other. You make a smaller target if you're standing sideways than broadside. Hamilton knows Burr is a man of no morals, but he considered him a gentleman. You only duel with people in your own social status. A master would never duel with his slave. He would duel with another slave owner. A wealthy New Yorker would only duel with another wealthy New Yorker, never with a guy who works on the docks or a sailor. So you only duel with your social equals, and they are strictly an affair of honor. Many duels ended with nobody being killed, most of them. Something like 80%, nobody's even injured. They missed. The guns were not very accurate. If you miss, then you can ask, do you want to reload and fire again? Sometimes they did, but the goal was to prove you were an honorable man and that you had courage. So if both missed, they could say, okay, the affair is settled. They walked off, and that was the end of it, and it was never mentioned again. But if you shoot and you miss, you stand there and let the other guy take his best shot. If he hits you, well, then he won. If he misses, then you both go home, and that's the end of the duel. So it's not quite the way we picture it in the histories. What happened is they had to cross the river, the Hudson River, to New Jersey because dueling had been declared illegal in New York City, although it still existed, particularly on the frontier, for decades, really up till the time of the Civil War. So they crossed the river into New Jersey, and they line up. Both men had written their wills, and in Hamilton's will, we found out later, he wrote, I have resolved, if God please, to throw away my first shot. And evidently, according to the people who were there, this is exactly what happened. They turned, they marched. Alexander Hamilton turned around and shot above Burr's head. There was a branch broken at the point where Burr stood. Now, the witnesses did not see this. They had turned their backs because dueling was illegal, and they could later swear in court, well, technically we saw nothing, so they wouldn't be arrested as accomplices. So they hear a shot, they turn around. Burr, branch clipped above his head, but Burr, taking the second shot and having no morals whatsoever, plugged Hamilton. And he is, as Hamilton said as he falls to the ground, this is a mortal wound, doctor. He knows. He has been shot in the abdomen. That's a death shot. That's a kill shot at the time. There's no medical care for that. They take him home. He dies in agony 2 days later. Why did he know? We don't know. Did he assume that Burr, once he shot, would do the same thing and be an honorable man and shoot above his head? Probably. Hamilton has some real issues. His eldest son was killed in a duel a year previous to this. He has depression. He is out of government. The Republicans have clearly taken over. His political career is through. Is he depressed and committing suicide and letting Burr do it? Death by duel? We don't know. But in any case, Burr did prove what Alexander Hamilton knew of him. He has no morals, either public or private. So Hamilton dies. Burr is Jefferson's vice president. Jefferson immediately removes the man from the vice presidency. Burr disappears. He shows up several years later in the West. This is an interesting story, where he is arrested for trying to organize a revolution in Kentucky to break away from the United States and create a separate empire west of the Allegheny Mountains, with, of course, Aaron Burr as president. He is tried for treason under Jefferson several years later and acquitted because if you look at the Constitution, again, it's good to read the Constitution, in order to be convicted of treason, there have to be 2 witnesses to the event. There were 1 witness to several events for Aaron Burr, but never 2 to the same event. So Burr got off. He disappears again and shows up in New York City finally as an old man in his mid-70s who has married a very attractive woman, very wealthy young woman, something like 25 years younger than he is. Aaron Burr was very much a ladies' man. This woman became very wealthy because she ran a whorehouse in New York City. So he marries a very wealthy madam, 25 years younger. A year later, she sues for divorce. On what grounds? Aaron Burr's infidelity at the age of 75 or 76, something like that. So Hamilton was absolutely right. Aaron Burr has no morals, public or private. And did Hamilton eliminate Burr? He knows even if he's involved in a duel one way or the other, he has to probably resign as vice president. So is Hamilton sacrificing himself to get rid of Burr? That's another theory. We don't know. A lot of strange events, but dueling continued for another 50, 60 years, even after the Civil War. It is an affair of honor, not a quick draw McGraw. Take care. Have a good day.